This is Center Stage, putting lawyers in the spotlight by highlighting attorneys and other industry experts to help take your law firm to the next level. Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Center Stage. I'm your host, John Henson, and today I'm joined by attorney Jason Canales. Jason, how are you doing today?
Good. Thanks so much for having me today, John.
Yeah, it's great. So this week we are talking about the challenges of an increasingly virtual legal world. And I know that, at least for us in the marketing world, especially when we're doing web design and internet marketing, we live in the virtual space. This hasn't really been much of a transition for us. It hasn't really caused that many obstacles, but I imagine in the legal world, especially with cases that have to go to trial, it's got to be a really big transition, especially when kind of the main thing, you've got to go to court. That's an in-person thing. And so, Jason, I know you're going to talk a lot about that. So, before we dive in, why don't you introduce yourself and let's get to know you a little bit.
Sure. So my name is Jason Canales, and I'm a litigator in New York City. I also, because of the pandemic, now have an office out on Eastern Long Island in the North Fork. It's beautiful out here. If any listeners have never been here before, it's wine country. It's a pretty cool place. It's sort of like the Napa of the East Coast in a way. My practice, like I said, is litigation. I focus on business litigation, securities litigation, commercial litigation, and real estate litigation. And I represent both individuals and corporations.
Awesome. So I kind of jumping in here, obviously 2020 with the pandemic, a lot of stuff was forced to go virtual. How are virtual court proceedings kind of becoming a thing? Do you think they're going to change the way that, the legal world and lawyers do their job?
Oh, totally, John. And what a transition it's been. We went from being in court on a daily basis in person before a judge with our adversaries right beside us, sometimes our clients, to, being on a computer with a camera in front of us and no one to the right or to the left of us. So it's been a complete transition. Initially, when the pandemic first started, there were no court proceedings in some states. In New York State, there were some proceedings still going on telephonically. There were court conferences and whatnot, but there weren't any virtual proceedings. So the courts also have had to really get up to speed quickly with respect to virtual platforms. And they've done a pretty good job in a short amount of time here in New York, at least. And so, there's a lot of new normals. The new normal is routine court appearances that you would be doing on a daily basis, happening through Zoom or Microsoft Teams. There have been bench trials, which are trials before a judge as opposed to a jury, that are happening now through Zoom or Microsoft Teams here in New York as well. And eventually, I think we'll see that there'll be some jury trials happening virtually as well.
Wow. So, what did your law firm do specifically to really adapt to this more virtual world, especially you as a litigator? Like, what did you do to make that transition?
Sure. So I invested in technology, which I think has been super important. I invested in the technology. I obtained a Zoom account. Mm-hmm. I also got Microsoft Teams. And so, through investment in technology, that has been super helpful. And I've also invested in getting training on how to work the technology. I've changed my office into a studio. So you see my background now is my logo. And, when I was working from home, which I was doing for a short period of time before coming back to the office, I changed my bedroom into a studio so that I would have the professional experience that was necessary to appear before the court and to also speak to clients and bring in new clients. I've taken some classes, and I think, the courts are offering classes on how to use their virtual platforms. And I sit on a bar committee on remote proceedings, and that's been super helpful because that's given me the opportunity to learn what is and what is not working for others with respect to these virtual spaces.
Yeah.
I've also gotten feedback from clients. I think that's super important. After a virtual chat with a client, I'll, reach out to them by email, asking if there's something that can be improved, how their experience was. And something that I've also done that I highly recommend is watching a virtual proceeding. So court proceedings are public, and so in many courthouses, you could find out by going online where the proceeding is going to be broadcasted, and you could watch it.
Yeah. So for me personally, because this is really fascinating to me, just because I think it's such a huge transition to make. What's the preparation like? Is it different? Are you finding that you are preparing differently for a virtual proceeding versus when you were going to court on a daily basis? Is it harder? Is it easier in some ways, or or is the jury, so to speak, still kind of out on that?
Yeah, so I actually think it's easier because you have more time, right? I'm not hopping onto a train to get to the courthouse, with 10 minutes to spare before I have to argue a motion. I'm doing it from my office, or I'm doing it from my home. And so I could, wake up on the morning of an appearance, and that half an hour that I would spend commuting, I could spend preparing for my argument. So yeah, in that regard, the preparation, I feel, has been easier. I do think that you do have to spend some time, and what I do is getting onto the virtual platform beforehand and testing it. Make sure I look okay. Make sure the lighting is okay. Make sure that my background looks professional, and also speaking to the court and my adversaries in terms of what the procedure is going to be with respect to the proceeding. I think that's super important. So you have to spend some additional time doing that. Whereas when you appeared in court, you didn't really have to do that because there would be a judge right in front of you, and the expectations as to how the proceeding is going to occur have been set in stone for many, many, many years.
Right. So what are some issues that you've seen when it comes to adapting to these new virtual proceedings?
Wow, so many issues. But the biggest issue, I think, is the lack of reliable virtual platforms. I think there's always the issue of people's screens freezing. And so, learning how to adapt to that has been difficult, but people seem to be catching on to it and figuring out ways to deal with those issues. The proceedings seem to take a bit more time. I think they take time because people are learning how to use the technology, during the proceeding. And then you have the issue of how do you do what you did in person virtually when it comes to, for instance, handing a witness an exhibit, right? Or objecting to a question, or speaking to a client off record. Also, what are the ground rules for a witness who is appearing virtually? And so those practices have changed and have become difficult to adapt to quickly.
So obviously, this is a big shift, but with a lot of these changes, there's obviously room for opportunities. And so speak for a second on just some of the opportunities that have risen out of this new virtual legal proceeding.
Yeah, so like I mentioned, no commute to the courthouse equals more time to prepare. Not having to physical office if you're working from home equals more time to develop business. From a business development perspective, virtual proceedings, at least for me, have also generated a new opportunity to get my name out by offering to clients a new service. And so now I sell virtual consults, right? I promote that on my website, and I promote that to my clients.
Awesome. So, I guess kind of, what I'm thinking about here, and if you don't have an answer for this, it's totally fine. For me, who's not an attorney, do you think, is there an advantage one way or another between plaintiffs and defendants, in a virtual world, or have judges and the legal system still been able to do a good job of keeping things pretty fair and allowing attorneys to still argue both sides so that there is still a good, fair outcome in cases?
Yeah, so, that's a great question. And on the one hand, I think from the perspective of plaintiffs and defendants who are both represented by counsel, it's been pretty fair. But I do think that virtual proceedings have presented and will continue to present issues concerning access to justice for pro se litigants or for pro se litigants, right? I think that's, people who may not have access to the technology or who may not be able to figure out how to use the technology. I think it could become problematic for them. But people who typically are represented by attorneys, I think it's been pretty fair so far.
Cool. And so kind of the last question here, where do you see this going? I mean, do you think that, virtual proceedings will stick around even after we kind of hopefully get back to normal? Or do you think like once, kind of COVID goes away and we're all kind of back, functioning as a normal society back before COVID, do you think it's just all going to go back to in person, or will there maybe circumstances where, oh, well, we've done virtual proceedings before, it's in our back pocket, we can do that, depending on the case?
Yeah, let me just cut back to my last answer in terms of fairness, because I think it relates to your question. So, I think we have to keep in mind that there are some litigation practices where individuals are required to appear in court with individual plaintiffs or defendants are required to appear in court with their attorney. In those cases, there have been issues of fairness raised because an attorney sitting in a different room or in a totally different state, right, from their client or their witness who they're representing, who also has to be present during the proceeding, may not have the same ability to communicate with the witness or their client that they otherwise would have had their client been sitting next to them in the courtroom. Right. And so in my practice, in a commercial litigation practice where the client doesn't often have to appear in court unless there's a hearing or a trial, I would say it's pretty fair. And I would argue that virtual proceedings will continue to happen. I think a lot of attorneys seem to prefer it. I think the court seems to prefer it. But in areas where, like you have pro se litigants or higher volume courts, where there are parties who have to actually appear at every appearance, for instance, like in a criminal action, right? I think it may not be the case that virtual proceedings are here to stay.
Got it. Yeah, and that makes sense. Especially like, to your point, you were talking earlier before we came on about mediation. Maybe there's opportunities there for mediations to stay virtual, it just out of convenience for everybody. And then maybe some different court cases there. So that's super interesting, just to kind of see how this has kind of forced the legal world, which at least in my eyes is always kind of stuck to traditions. Especially just with how court systems and everything have gone on. So it's very interesting to see like how it's forced that change, so quickly. And it's good to see that you guys have adapted. And to that point, of the opportunities that it's been provided, you made a good point about how you can now sell virtual consultations and stuff like that, and that's such a great forward thinking way of looking at it. And for attorneys out there to take advantage of that virtual space. And so really great stuff. So before we wrap up here, I like to end the show this way. So, Jason, if you had one piece of advice that you could give all the attorneys out there, what would it be? So I'm old enough to remember when firms started using or issuing BlackBerries to lawyers. Some lawyers were totally freaked out by it. It changed the way they practiced in that they became more accessible. They had to learn to communicate with clients more rapidly. The technology also seemed so confusing. Over time, and after more and more people started using BlackBerries, things got a lot easier. The technology got a lot better, and it was almost like if you didn't have a BlackBerry, you weren't a good lawyer, right? Right. We look at the BlackBerry now as an ancient relic. I think the same is going to happen with virtual platforms such as Zoom and Microsoft Teams. I think virtual proceedings will definitely be the new norm in a couple of years, and so my advice to lawyers out there is don't resist the change, embrace it. It's the new normal. Yeah, I agree. Kind of going back to something that you said earlier and how you invested in the technology, we kind of did the same thing here. I got this fancy new mic. I have a ring light over here to kind of balance out the light on the ceiling with my face. We got this nice backdrop here rather than a plain wall. You've got your logo. It's small things like that that can really make for a better user experience, all that kind of stuff where, some lawyers, the ones that are hesitant to it will probably just stick with like the webcam on their laptop and hope that the microphone sounds okay. Maybe they don't really care about their internet connection and it's, really spotty at best. And so, small things like that will really start to become differentiators in who clients end up working with. So that's, among all of your points that you made today, those are some of the really good points. So I really do appreciate you coming on today and talking about this. I thought this was really good, and definitely hope that everybody got something out of this.
Great. Thanks so much for having me.
Awesome. So for everyone else out there, continue to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and wherever you're consuming the show, and we will see you next week. Thanks for listening. To learn more, go to spotlightbranding.com/center stage.